Welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and I'm here with Dr. Bill Campbell. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so excited you're here. Do you want to, before we get started, do you want to tell our listeners just a little bit about you, about your background with nutrition, exercise, kind of what got you to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to talk about myself for a few minutes. So my initial career path was not in exercise and nutrition. I started off studying marketing, and I got a job as a sales rep where I would sell herbicides and pesticides. So I would sell chemicals to kill weeds and to kill bugs. And needless to say, that was not what I was passionate about. At that time, I was in my early 20s and I loved bodybuilding. I loved lifting weights. I loved sports nutrition, like dietary supplements. So that was my passion. And I read a quote somewhere. I don't remember where I read it, but it said, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. So I kind of started thinking, I'm like, well, I love bodybuilding and trying to enhance my physique. Maybe I should do that for a living because I don't want to work. I'm pretty lazy. So I kind of started taking the steps to change careers. So I didn't have any science classes, so I had to go back to school, start taking anatomy, physiology, biology, organic chemistry, like all of these classes. And then eventually, I'm now in my late 20s, I start a master's program in exercise physiology. Then I thought, maybe I should get a PhD. And I did that. So my PhD was in nutrition and preventive health. And at that point, I realized my dream was to kind of direct my own research laboratory. And after graduating with my PhD from Baylor University in Texas, I did what any good husband would do. I said to my wife, where do you want to live? She said, we have to live somewhere where it's warm. So honoring her request, we are now in our 13th year at the University of South Florida, which is in Tampa, Florida. And I direct the Performance and Physique Enhancement Laboratory there.
Awesome, awesome. That is, well, we talked about this before we started recording, but I'm definitely familiar with Florida. Tampa, I actually have a bunch of friends. Do you know of Dr. Jacob Wilson, Dr. Ryan Lowry
Yes.
at ASPI?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, Ryan is actually one of my best friends, so it's a small world. And then we were talking, Sean Wells, and I just finished recording with him. So it's crazy, like this world of nutrition and exercise. It's like there's so many people in it, but it's really like very small if you think about it.
I
And so many
agree.
different connections. Yeah. So I want to dive into kind of all things body composition and talk about some of the research you've done because it's super interesting. So why don't we start with this concept of body recomposition? I kind of want to get your feedback on, what I guess we can kind of tell our listeners what body recomposition actually is, and kind of like your research within that realm and what you've found over the years, both maybe in the lab and then also like kind of practical application of, I guess, and I'll just say body recomposition, meaning losing body fat and gaining muscle simultaneously. Is that a thing? Is it possible? Like, what have you found?
Yes. And I think it's probably important if I give a little context to my research. So let me do that
Yeah.
because kind of will put a filter over everything I say.
Okay.
So my research focus is to help people optimize their physiques within a maintainable lifestyle. So what does that mean? A lot of people will take my work or a lot of my research outcomes and they'll say, well, this is what bodybuilders should do. That can be true in many cases, but I don't really study bodybuilders. I learn from them. I love to, because they have mastered the art of fat loss and muscle gain. But what I do is it's scaled back a notch or two to help what I would say people who are already fit, who want to look even better, or who want to be even leaner. On the other side of the spectrum, my research does not investigate obese individuals. Obese individuals can take my research and apply it to them in many cases, but I'm really in this space where it's people who are high performers, but they're not elite. It's like me and my wife. that we're not going to step on stage, but we want to look like we could step on stage within a few weeks. So there's the context to all of my research. And just to throw out the warning, if you're an elite level bodybuilder, some of this may not apply. If you are currently obese, some of what I'm saying may not apply.
Okay.
So now back to the body recomposition question, and I liked your definition. Is it possible to gain muscle and lose fat at the same time? I used to think, particularly when I was in grad school, that wasn't possible, that you can't do both. And what I've since learned, not only from my own research in my own lab, but plenty of other research publications have also reported that this is possible. And when I say this is possible, people are losing fat and gaining muscle at the same time. Is it something that's common? No. Is it something that people should expect to happen? No. I would say it's rare, but there's too many records of it in the published literature that you can't say, I don't think you can honestly say it's not possible. So it is possible. And with that, it's possible even for people who have been training a while. So I'll give the two scenarios where we're seeing some common threads. One area is people are always resistance training. If you're going to lose fat and gain muscle, every study that I've ever read where I've seen this, the people are resistance training and they have a relatively high protein intake.
Okay.
One other thing I'll add to this, we just got a paper accepted for publication. Chris Barakat from the University of Tampa and Dr. Guillermo Escalante, we wrote a review paper on this topic, and we highlight all of the different research studies that have reported this exact concept of body recomposition. Mm-hmm. So again, I think a lot of people, and again, including myself, I'm thinking, well, I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can intellectually be honest and say it's not impossible. Now, I will say this, from a practical standpoint, I think it is better to designate your goal. Are you in a place where you want to lose fat? Then I think you would adopt a certain set of actions that would facilitate that goal. Or are you in a place where you're trying to gain muscle? I think there are another set of circumstances and actions that would best serve you for that goal. To try to do both, I don't think you're maximizing either outcome.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Would you say that from like your research observations that there's like a specific, so from what I've kind of researched and anecdotally over the years and with myself and with clients, there, when you get to kind of, we can call it quote unquote, like the last 5 to 10 pounds, right? And this is not necessarily like the actual 5 to 10 pounds, but when people are in that range, you're like, oh, I just want to lose the last 5 to 10 pounds. I want to get toned. Do you think that it's harder for those individuals to recomp versus some who may be like 20 or 30 pounds away? Is there any kind of anything that you've seen with that?
My intuition would say yes, and particularly if those people have been dieting for a while. If they've been dieting and now they're running into some roadblocks for further fat loss, I think in that case, yes. But we do know that there are published studies to suggest that even advanced resistance training people who have been resistance training for years can experience body recomposition. And again, I want to say, is it common? No. I would say probably 90% of the time you should not expect that outcome, but it does happen. And the other thing I would say, and we're going to get into this later, is nobody's doing this in a hurry. This takes time. This is not a month-long process. This is, on the short end, probably 8 weeks of highly consistent habits and executing on meal by meal, workout by workout objectives.
Okay. That makes sense. Okay, so you did mention a little bit about, someone who's been dieting for a while. So can we talk a little bit about, and this is something that I have to explain to my clients a lot and for myself too, just going through this anecdotally, it's like, we can't always be dieting, right? Like, especially if we have a goal of looking, you know, quote unquote, I get this a lot. Like, I want to look toned, I want to look good, um, but I, you know, maybe I've dieted down and I look, you know, skinny fat is one of those words that are thrown around, right? And that's where you maybe you do lose a lot of weight, but then you have no muscle mass, so you're kind of like, I thought I would look good at this particular weight, but I don't look as I thought I would look, right? So kind of talking about going back to this body recomposition idea, but then also kind of transitioning into the consequences of, you know, being on a diet for such a long period of time, like what that can do to your hormones, your body, how that can maybe interfere with what your ultimate goal is to actually look quote unquote toned, right? And build some muscle. Are there, like, can we talk about kind of the consequences of dieting for long periods of time and being in a deficit for an extended period of time, and like what that does to your body?
Yes, yeah. And I think this is particularly important for people who I and you serve, which are people who, again, they're not obese, but these are people who are trying to optimize their physiques. But a lot of these negatives still apply to everybody. So
Mm-hmm.
let's make an assumption. There's somebody who wants to not lose their muscle mass. They'd like to gain a little bit of muscle mass, and they would like to lose fat. And what we know about dieting is when you reduce your calories, so you're in a caloric deficit, if you're going to try to build muscle, you are automatically putting your body to work against you when you reduce your calories in terms of muscle gain. I'll give two examples from an acute perspective. When you're trying to build muscle, you're trying to optimize muscle protein synthesis rates, and you're trying to lower the rates of muscle protein breakdown. If you can do that, you will gain muscle over time. Being in a caloric deficit, kind of, or not even kind of, specifically thinking of two specific publications, it does the opposite. One example was a 20% caloric deficit reduced muscle protein synthesis by about 20%. So that's making it more difficult to build muscle when your rate of building it is lessened. On the other side of this, we also see about a 20% increase in muscle protein breakdown during a caloric deficit. So I said this before, and I'll just reiterate it. When you're in a caloric deficit, you're not optimizing your body's ability to gain muscle mass. So you're already not choosing the best choices to gain muscle mass. Now let's look at your metabolic rate. If you happen to go on a caloric deficit, especially if it is a chronic diet, week after week, month after month, what happens is your metabolic rate will slow down with weight loss. And what that does is two things. It makes it harder and harder to continue to lose fat, and it makes it more likely that you're going to gain weight in the future, or as soon as your diet is, quote, over, you're now primed to put on body fat. I'll give one more negative consequence of dieting, besides just being grouchy and hungry.
Yeah.
That's a given. The other thing is if you are in a hurry to lose weight, so if you go on a crash diet, what happens is you lose muscle mass. Yes, you lose fat, but you induce what is a condition or a consequence known as hyperphagia, which is really an overwhelming and strong desire to eat. Some people would call it like an insatiable desire to eat. And what happens is if you lose weight too quickly, or if you're doing a crash diet, what happens is once you're off of that diet, you continue to have this very strong drive to eat, and you experience what is known as fat overshoot. And that is where, as you're gaining weight back, you actually have gained more fat after your diet has been over than what you started the diet with. And we know from the scientific literature, this happens when there is a pretty severe caloric restriction that lasts for an extended period of time, like weeks and months. So there's and you can talk about hormonal implications as well. In males, testosterone levels go down, cortisol levels go up in males and females. Thyroid hormones will tend to be suppressed. And we start to see them a lot more as people get leaner and leaner and leaner. So there is a host of consequences to dieting. And let me just say this. I have I try to make things easy for people to remember. There are 3 things you can do. And again, I know we're probably going to touch on these throughout. But the 3 best things that you can do in your daily life to prevent all of these negative consequences of dieting is to lose weight slowly, keep protein high when dieting, and resistance train.
Okay, I love it. I love it. So can we dive a little bit into the specifics of those 3 things in terms of maybe the research that you found? And I guess also, like, if someone's listening to this and they just listened to everything you said about, the consequences of dieting. So, and they're like, okay, well, what do I do? Right? Like I'm there. I've been, dieting for so long. I stopped seeing results. I don't know where to go from here, or I want to maybe do it the right way. Like, what would your advice be for that?
Yeah, and again, let me say this just because I've realized I want to over communicate rather than under communicate. This may not apply to bodybuilders stepping on stage. This might not apply to somebody who's morbidly obese. So, but everybody else, I think the way that you approach this is you don't want to spend a large portion of your life dieting. You want to diet as little as possible. So there's the first, mm-hmm. Even before we get into these 3 other principles, let's not spend the next 50 weeks in a caloric deficit. And if you do, the longer and longer you're in that, the more miserable you'll be. And you're kind of like beating your head against the wall because of this metabolic adaptation or your metabolic rate slowing down, you're just making it difficult for yourself. Mm-hmm. So back to these 3 principles. The first one is to lose weight slowly. Now, when I say weight, I really mean fat. We're trying to lose fat loss or trying to lose fat mass, but not everybody knows how much muscle and fat they have. So I try to expand it to incorporate everybody who just has a scale. And if they have their body composition numbers, great. But I think a maximal rate of weight loss is about % per week. If you start to lose more than that, so for me, that would be about 2 pounds per week. If you're 120 pounds, that might be, around 3 pounds per month. If you start losing weight at a greater rate than that, you're much more likely to be losing muscle mass and not as much fat. What I found in my research and in this general physique enhancement research is the slower the rate of weight loss, the better the outcome in terms of 1, adherence, and 2, the weight you're losing will be primarily from fat stores and not from muscle mass. And there's a direct correlation between loss of muscle and your metabolic rate slowing down. Do you have any follow-up questions to that, or should I move into the protein aspect?
No, I mean, I completely agree. And that's something too. It's like, I work with a lot of one-on-one clients, and I have like a minimum 3-month commitment of working with them. Cause I'm like, the first month is just figuring out where you're at. And I mean, all of my clients go past the 3 months because, like you said, and that's exactly what I say, like between 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week is a good rate. And I think there's kind of a lot of people get confused with that too, because they hear, oh, you should be losing, 1 to 2 pounds per week. And that's an overall generalization. But exactly what you said, if you're 250 pounds versus 120 pounds, like that's not relative to that. So I think exactly what you said, I completely agree with. So yeah, you can continue to the next point.
Yeah. And I'll just say how much I respect you for having that 3-month commitment for the continued education, because it's hard to get people to commit to that. You're up against the entire infomercialization aspect of the diet culture. You're up against plenty of, I don't want to say unethical, but coaches who could care less about the long-term health of their clients. It's a much harder way to make a living. to have this approach because it's not sexy and it's not quick. I think I wanted to add one more thing to the, oh yes. And I would, especially as you're working with people who are, let's say, like 100 to 150 pounds, I think it's better to take it as a month at a time. I do advocate, unless there is some type of psychological issues with weighing yourself every day, I recommend people weigh themselves every day and then take a weekly average. Mm-hmm. But in this case, if you're taking like a 120-pound person, let's monitor your progress over the month. Can we lose 5 pounds in a month? Because when you start getting down to 0.8 pounds per week, some scales aren't sensitive enough to even detect those kinds of changes. So even just elongating your assessment period, I think, is better. Now, for me, about 200 pounds, it's much easier for me to look at 2 pounds or 1.5 pounds per week. But I even like this. Let's take the month, see what happened, and do we need to adjust? And then the other thing with weighing yourself every day, you take out the daily fluctuations of the scale. Menstrual cycles can be accounted for through all of this. So big fan of that. So let's move on to my second point. The second, what I call principle of fat loss, is to not decrease protein when dieting. Now this, as you know, because you're a little bit more in the ketogenic space, that has some, let's say, special applications for if you're working with ketogenic clients. For non-ketogenic dieting people, what I want to suggest is, if anything, when you're going on a diet, don't decrease protein. If anything, increase it as you're reducing your calories. So I think a great first step for anybody is to say, you want to lose body fat, and I'm telling you, we want to gain muscle or at least maintain our muscle. Let's do this. For the next month, we're not going to reduce your calories at all. You're not even going to be on a diet. But what we are going to do is we're going to increase your protein, and we're going to reduce your carbohydrates or fat. You choose. It doesn't matter to me. I'm on this preference philosophy. And I'm going to predict that your body composition will change in 30 days without you even dieting, without you even reducing your calories. And on a related note, my lab is going to be starting a research study. It'll be the largest research study we've done exactly on this topic, because I've seen this in my own consulting. I'd like to see if I can demonstrate this in an actual controlled environment. So how does that work? It works for people who don't have really high protein intakes to start with. If they're eating really high protein to start with, I'm not going to suggest that they even go higher, but that's not most people. And what we know about protein when dieting is, first of all, adherence is key. How can we keep you on this diet? And out of the 3 macronutrients, protein is the most satiating. So it's your best friend in controlling your hunger. So I want to prioritize the one nutrient that's going to help you win the hunger battle day after day after day. The second thing is, we know that it helps maintain muscle mass, and it has the highest thermic effect on food, which means your body's going to burn more calories as it digests and absorbs and processes that protein. So any way you look at a higher protein diet when dieting, or a higher protein intake when dieting, there is no negative consequence. Other than, let's talk about this, what if you have somebody who just hates protein? They're not going to take protein supplements. They don't like meats. Then my challenge would be, okay, we might not be able to increase it a lot, but can we increase it a little? In worst case, we're just not going to reduce it when you diet, if at all possible.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's completely, I agree with all of that. People listen to this podcast know that I'm all about protein. And I think it's one of those things, especially in like coming from the lower carb keto space, there was like a period of time where there was like a fear of protein and a fear of, gluconeogenesis and all of these things. But I think thinking about it practically too, especially someone who's, maybe on the outside looking in or has never done keto before, anything like that, I talk about this all the time on the podcast. Keto is it's not a one size fits all. And the standard ketogenic diet, which was created to treat epilepsy, is moderate low protein, but that's not necessarily what your average person should be following, right? Like you can still, get into a state of ketosis if that's the goal and be following a high protein diet and even, higher carbs too. It depends on the person. But with all that being said, I just want to reiterate, like I've always, I've always been down the camp of higher protein. And I think it's super important, especially with a lot of the women I work with. I haven't really had any one woman come to me who was actually eating enough protein. And so exactly what you said, that's the first thing we do. It's like, we're not going to just drop your calories right off the bat. Let's increase your protein and see what that does because of all the things that you just said. So I completely agree with all of that.
And I'm curious, since you're living in the real world and not in a lab, do you notice favorable body composition changes with that one change?
Yes. And it's exactly what you said about the adherence part of it. People, they say, I feel so much more full. I had a client last week say, I'm like, I don't think I can eat all my calories because I feel so full off of all this protein. I'm like, all right, well, and the goal is with her is fat loss. I'm like, okay, well, you're starting to see like why this is so important. And then also with muscle retention and building muscle and all of that, it's just, every single client that I've worked with has come to me, especially with women who are coming from the low carb keto space, have been under eating protein in my opinion. And so when we kind of bump that up, it's crazy what happens without even like touching calories sometimes. You obviously have to, touch calories once you get down the line and get, more along your journey and all of that. But I'm a huge fan of upping the protein. Would you say that like in general, what would your recommendation be in terms of like grams per pound?
So yeah, I try to be as simple as possible. So sometimes that's not always evidence-based. So the evidence would suggest that 1.6 or let's just say 0.75 grams of protein per pound is all that you need to maximize muscle mass adaptations. I like to say one gram per pound of body weight. Make that your lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Yes, I cannot show you scientific evidence that that's better for building muscle mass. But I do believe, and I have some research, I'm aware of about 4, possibly 5 studies, I have to read another one, where these higher protein intakes are causing greater losses of fat mass. So it's not only about muscle, it's also about reducing fat for people who are trying to optimize their physiques. And I believe, based on a handful of studies, that higher than 0.75 grams per pound achieves that outcome. It's better for fat loss and muscle gain.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I agree. And I think that's kind of my kind of range is usually 0.8 to 1.2 grams per pound, just depending on the person, obviously, especially the deeper you get into that deficit, having higher protein around, especially with women who are not, super overweight, like 1.2 grams per pound is usually where I go. That's where I personally kind of go to if I am, on a cut or whatever it may be. It's like 1 to 1.2 is a good place to be. So yeah, I completely agree with that. So do you want to talk about the third point?
Yeah, the third's quick because, well, it can be quick. It's just to resistance train when dieting. So all of my research studies, it's centered around resistance exercise. If you're trying to optimize your physique, it's going to be difficult to do that without an appreciation and an adoption of resistance training. Now, if you have somebody who says, I hate lifting weights, but I'd like to lose some fat, okay, that's fine. But you likely aren't going to increase or maintain your muscle mass as well. But any type of activity is better than no activity. So for those types of people who don't enjoy resistance training, well, what do you enjoy doing? Let's do that. Okay. But again, my research really only applies to people who are resistance training and adopting these other behaviors as they seek to optimize their physiques.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's dive a little bit into your research. I definitely want to talk about, because I know you just had a study published about maybe 3 months ago. I actually talked about it on. I record solo episodes, like Q&A episodes,
Yeah.
for the podcast, and I talked all about your study on refeeds and diet breaks. I think it was like 2 or 3 months ago it got
Mark.
published. March, yeah, okay. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Maybe start off with, what, so we went from talking about the consequences of being in a deficit for a long period of time, and you've done a lot of research on refeeds and diet breaks, and I've talked about that plenty of times on the podcast, so hopefully the listeners are familiar with that. But do you want to kind of give a little bit of a synopsis of what a diet break and a refeed is, and how you've implemented that within your research in your lab and what you found with your studies?
Yes, yeah, let's do that. And you made a great transition. The only way that this concept of diet breaks or diet refeeds, the only way that they make sense is to first appreciate all of the negative consequences of dieting. If you don't start with that appreciation, then these strategies really don't have a basis in fact to even employ. So the philosophy is, let's not spend a lot of time in a caloric deficit. So there's one of my general philosophies. So there's a concept, and I'm going to give the most broad definition initially, and that term is called nonlinear dieting. And what nonlinear dieting is, it's just different strategies where you're not going to be constantly in a caloric deficit. Maybe you take a week off from dieting every month. Maybe you take the weekends off from dieting. So you diet Monday through Friday. You can even get a little bit micro scaled and say, well, I'm going to eat from noon to 8, but I'm going to diet, or I'm going to fast from the time I wake up till noon. So you can even get very specific. But the concept of nonlinear dieting is taking a break from the diet. And underneath that broad concept is two other words or terms: diet breaks and diet refeeds. And there's not a consensus yet on how they're defined. I'm going to tell you how we've defined them in the scientific literature. A diet break is typically defined as at least 1 week or 7 days, sometimes it's 2 weeks, of taking a break from the diet. So you've stopped dieting and now you're increasing your calories back to maintenance levels. So you're not doing a free for all. And the reason you do that is to offset a lot of these negative consequences, which we talked about earlier. And I'll just talk about the diet break aspect of this. The research on diet breaks, again, when there's at least 1 and up to 2 weeks, sometimes even more than that. One study had, I think it was up to 6 weeks of a diet break. The literature is usually reporting that there's no benefit. In some cases, there's a clear benefit for additional fat loss, but there is never a negative consequence to taking these breaks. So it's never negative. Sometimes it doesn't add, or it doesn't give you a benefit of greater fat loss. And other studies have reported that it is better for fat loss. And there's one consistent theme in the studies that have shown that it's actually better for fat loss. And those two themes are, one, they are prescribed or they're planned. It's not like these people have fallen off the wagon and totally just blew their diet and say, oh, I'll count that as a diet break. That's never been shown. It's always, this is part of your plan. I want you to increase your food intake for the next week or two. And then the other thing is, they are still controlling their calories when they're taking a break from their diet. So they're not having, a lot of people use the word cheat days or cheat week. I guess you can call it whatever you want, but the research usually puts it back to what they were eating before their diet started, not above that. So I like to say maintenance calories. In the one most recent study called the Matador study, pretty famous study in obese males, they found that the efficiency of fat loss was significantly greater when they took 2 weeks off from dieting. So they would diet 2 weeks, take 2 weeks off, diet 2 weeks, take 2 weeks off. They also had a better elevated metabolic rate after this diet. So in that study, there was nothing but positive outcomes. Now, the one negative outcome one could say is, well, it took them twice as long to lose their weight. And I would say that's not a negative. That's probably better for their adherence and making these changes into their lifestyle. So I don't even look at that as a negative. Now, again, if you're a bodybuilder stepping on stage, yes, that's a negative because you don't have the luxury of elongating diets in many cases. So, but in our population, which we defined earlier, the longer it takes you to lose the weight and to adopt those habits and make them part of your lifestyle, I'm going to say that's a better approach. A slower approach is going to be better. So there's the diet break aspect of this. The other term, and this is what we just published our study on, is called diet refeeds. Refeeds tend to be 1 or 2 days per week of the same approach where you're increasing your calories. And what we did, and if you remember my philosophy, I'm trying to help people optimize their physiques within a maintainable lifestyle. What I know is that in my own life, and there's research to support this, which is kind of cool, when do most people increase their food intake during the week? It's the weekends. People eat more food. Do you eat more on the weekends or not?
Yeah. Yep.
So,
Yeah, and I know what you're gonna. I don't want to ruin what you're gonna say, but yeah.
so me being the, let's just say the not stupid researcher that I am, I said, let's design a diet that works with these natural food intake selections of our participants. So we designed a diet refeed study that had 2 groups. One group dieted for 7 weeks straight. They never took a break. They never increased their calories. The other group, we said, you are going to take a break every weekend. And we're doing this because this is how you naturally eat anyway, or that's what the literature would suggest. So Monday through Friday, they dieted. Saturday and Sunday, we increased their calories, all in the form of carbohydrate, back to maintenance levels. So both groups dieted for 7 weeks. The average caloric restriction that we did in this study was 25% of a caloric restriction per week. But for the group that was doing the refeeds, they had to diet harder Monday through Friday because they had the 2 days of higher calories. So they actually reduced their calories by 35% Monday through Friday instead of 25% for 7 days. At the end of this study, this was males and females, by the way. The end of the study, we reported that they significantly maintained their muscle mass better than the group who didn't take the break. They lost a little bit, like a pound of muscle. And they also significantly maintained their metabolic rate as compared to the group who didn't have any refeeds. They lost on average about 40 calories of their metabolic rate per day, whereas the other group lost 80 calories of their metabolic rates per day. So we were able to maintain muscle and metabolic rate by having these spikes in calories that were planned and controlled every weekend.
I love it. I love it. And so would you say, so you said those, so we would kind of refer, and these are tools that I use with my own clients. And I actually specifically have, it's called the Keto for Women program. It's women who have gone keto for a long time and they've kind of hit this plateau. They don't know where to go from there. And so within this 3-month program, I actually implement a 5-2 split, which is, 5 days in a deficit, 2 days refeed via carbohydrates, or we talk about a little bit other things, but I want to ask you that in a second. But that's definitely a principle that I use in a tool. And I think it's really important because a lot of people kind of think that calories, quote unquote, reset overnight, right? And I used to have that mentality, years ago. But when you kind of put this thought, when you put the mentality in your brain, like, okay, it's not a night to night thing. Like if we can look at calories on a weekly basis versus day to day basis, then everything changes, right? Because we can implement exactly what you're talking about, calorie cycling tools and refeeds and things like that, and still have results. So I do want to ask, so in terms of the refeeds on the weekend, so you said those came from carbohydrates. Is there, because I know there's some research out there in terms of leptin and things like that. Is there any like specific research that you've come across or that you've noticed, not maybe not in the research, but anecdotally, by increasing those calories with carbohydrates versus if you were to do that with like fat or protein?
So we based our decision on increasing calories from carbohydrates based on two things. One was a study, I think it was a 3-day increase in carbohydrates in non-resistance trained females where there was an acute increase in leptin levels. So we had that. Now there's a lot of, again, that was in non-resistance training people. The other thing is I really study what physique coaches and online coaches like yourself are doing in the real world. And that seemed to be what most people were doing with their clients, taking a carbohydrate-centric approach to their refeeds. So that's what I wanted to test. So there was some evidence and some practicality as which informed our decisions to do that. I can't say that if we increased their calories back to maintenance levels by fat that we wouldn't see the same thing, because I don't know. Mm-hmm. But that was the reason why we chose to do carbohydrates.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And when we're talking about bringing our calories to maintenance level, can you talk a little bit about how you would find that maintenance level? Because if we think, we talk about as we die, especially if you're someone who's going from 200, maybe you lost 20 pounds over the past month, so your maintenance intake when you were 20 pounds heavier is probably not the same maintenance as you are 20 pounds lighter. So if there's someone who is saying, oh, well, I don't know how to find my maintenance, so how do I know what to bring my calories to? What would you say, like, how would you direct them to do that, I guess?
Yes, I'll say what we have done and what we continue to do in our ongoing research. And then I'll say that why there's an issue with that's impossible to get around. So in our refeed study, which I just mentioned, and we just completed data collection on a diet break study, and this was all in females, resistance trained females. And by the way, a lot of my research is focused on females. We have multiple studies that's only females are the subjects. So we have this protein study that we talked about earlier that's going to start hopefully this semester. That's in females as well. But we take a 2-week period before they start their diet, and we have them track their macros every day for 14 days. We've been giving them scales to make sure that they're not gaining or losing weight. And we hone in on those 2 weeks of counting that as their maintenance. And again, we are monitoring if they're gaining or losing weight. If they're losing weight, then they're probably not at their maintenance, or if they're gaining weight, they're not at their maintenance. So that's what we do, a 2-week period of telling them through nutrition. We have nutrition coaches on my research team, really stressing the point, don't change anything. Just do what you normally do. Weigh yourself every day. And then throughout the next 7 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks of our studies, we are referring back to those maintenance calories. So our studies aren't that long where I feel like we can still rely on that. But even if their metabolic rate has gone down, or their maintenance calories has gone down, then if anything, they're eating in a slight caloric surplus by week 5, 6, 7, 8. The only other thing you could do is just factor in some type of regression equation to say, hey, now we're going to have you at 0.9 times your maintenance calories. But that would just be an estimation. So what's nice about what my lab has done, you can take them back to maintenance calories that was from 7 or 8 weeks ago and still rely on our outcome of maintaining muscle mass, maintaining metabolic rate, even if in the likely scenario that their maintenance calories has gone down and they were actually eating in a caloric surplus, although it would be slight. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's exactly how, again, going back to the 3-month commitment when I work with clients, it's like the first, 2 to 3 weeks is just really finding, especially with most of my clients come to me because they're looking to lose body fat and recomp and all of that. But the first 2 weeks, 2, 3 weeks is really just finding what your maintenance is, because a lot of people, they go online and they Google, how to find calories, and it's like all these macro calculators. And yes, some can come close, but everybody's so different. Your activity level, how long you've dieted for in the past, where you're at. Like there's so many different factors that play into it. So finding, what your maintenance is I think that's the number one thing to start off with. So exactly what you said, like that's super important to know that, because that is what you can make adjustments from going down the line. So I think that's something too, like, if we're talking about practicality and working, with people one-on-one and things like that, it's, if you go to a coach and they immediately give you a calorie number that is like just out of nowhere, right? It's like complete, like maybe they used a calculation, but it's a lower calorie number, and they haven't even maybe like looked at your food intake or looked at your maintenance over a period of time to see what it actually is. Then you could be, who knows if you're in a deficit, or who knows what that percentage of the deficit is. So I think that's just something, like, for anybody listening, just, I think the biggest thing is, I mean, in my eyes, I want to eat as much as possible and still get results at the same time, versus, like you said, going on a severe calorie deficit and not even really knowing what that is, right? So just something that a thought that came to mind. But no, that makes total sense. So I do have a question about, so after kind of going through the diet and the cut and your research and all of that, have you done anything, or have you observed anything with, coming out of that? So, once you, go on the diet, once you lost the weight, what's next, right? Like this kind of concept of reverse dieting. Have you done any studies with that in your lab or anything like that?
We've done a few things around it. And reverse dieting is, let's make sure we're using that we're agreeing on the definition. So the diet has ended, and now we're going to slowly increase your calories with the hope that you don't gain weight, or that you don't gain fat as we're increasing your calories. Is that how you would define that concept?
Yes. And so I guess, yeah, I mean, reverse dieting in the sense of, I mean, I look at, so you've heard of probably the recovery diet, right? So I feel like that's a newer concept. I feel like reverse dieting's concept has been around for a while, and now there's this newer concept of recovery dieting. But yeah, in general, it's just like, okay, what do we do after the diet? Because we know that, especially if you've lost, 30 pounds, you can't just, go back to eating the amount that you were eating 30 pounds ago, because that would be, you would be in a calorie surplus now because you have lost 30 pounds. We talked about metabolic adaptation. Maybe we can chat a little bit more about metabolic adaptation and what that, because I feel like sometimes people think, oh, my metabolism's slowing down, this is a negative thing, or I'm going through metabolic adaptation. Can we maybe talk about like how that's not necessarily a negative thing, but that's just part of, losing weight? It's your body is adapting versus what most people hear is like, my metabolism slowed down. Kind of, can maybe talk about that a little bit more, just to clear that up.
So the term metabolic adaptation describes the fact that as you've been dieting, your metabolic rate will slow down. That is a natural occurrence. If you are 200 pounds this month and you're 170 pounds in 4 months, your metabolic rate will slow down. It slows down with weight loss. Mm-hmm. This term of adaptive thermogenesis describes a situation where your metabolic rate has slowed down more than what you would predict from your weight loss. We want to avoid that.
Okay.
I would say, and I think this is going to be a directive for future research, the idea of nonlinear dieting, diet refeeds, diet breaks, are going to reduce the occurrence of metabolic adaptation. So if you take that approach, those are problems that I think we're solving on the back end, that currently that people just, they diet for 24 weeks in a row. Well, of course they're going to have metabolic adaptation. And they're probably eating very, very low calories by that point if they tried to continue to lose fat. So I like to look at these approaches of taking breaks from dieting throughout the journey as preventing the what used to be the inevitable endpoint of a diet.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing with a reverse or recovery diet, I think that is where the bodybuilding culture has unduly influenced my culture, which is normal people.
Mm-hmm.
A recovery diet, and I'm gonna talk about research that we did exactly on this topic in a case series study. So a recovery diet, well, let's put them both. So we have recovery diet and we have the reverse diet. They both exist for, at least in my purview, a bodybuilder has stepped on stage. They competed and they are lean, and now it's time for them to stop dieting. They have two options, two educated options, we'll say. Recovery diet, the other one is what the hell, I'll just eat whatever. So not counting that option. The bodybuilder now says, okay, I have two options. I can do a recovery diet. A recovery diet is rather quickly, but controlled, gaining fat back on that body. If you can gain fat quickly as a bodybuilder, you're going to recover the recovery diet. You're going to recover hormones faster. You're going to be able to gain muscle mass faster. You're in your off season. That makes sense. The reverse diet says, okay, I'm done competing, but I'm going to slowly increase my calories.
I didn't get that. Could you try?
Siri, she doesn't understand the difference.
Oh, well, she's one of the thousands who struggle with this. The reverse diet says I'm going to go slow, and still an educated approach. And the idea there is we're going to increase calories slowly so you don't gain fat very much. I think if you're a competitive bodybuilder, the recovery diet makes a lot of sense because you want to gain the weight back so you can start training hard again, get your hormones back. Mm-hmm. The reverse diet, I think, is a better approach for lifestyle people who want to look leaner throughout their everyday life. You're going to have a lean, but it's a lot more difficult because, again, you just came out of a pretty severe diet and now you're slowly, and you're still dieting, but you're slowly adding calories back in. What we did in my lab, and we also published this and it's open access, we published a case series study where this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to test bodybuilders, bikini competitors, physique competitors, figure athletes after their show. We let them self-select. Do you want to gain fat quickly after your show, their recovery diet, or do you want to gain fat a little more slowly after your show? And that was the reverse diet. So that was our intent. And I think we had 7 or 8 subjects in our study. And I need to mention James Longstrom was my graduate research student at the time. He coordinated this study, designed it, talked with Lane Norton, Eric Helms, kind of like the people who have popularized these approaches. So he did a great job. So while we had great intentions of saying what's better, recovery or reverse, unfortunately, the application of these bodybuilders, even though they said they wanted to do a reverse, they didn't always do a reverse. Sometimes they gained weight pretty quickly. Some of the people who said, yeah, I want to do a recovery and gain fat fast, they didn't always do that. So we did not have enough of a separation to actually analyze, hey, what's the difference here? Instead, what we had to do was say, what happens 8 weeks after your show as you increase calories? Because again, they just overlapped too much. And what we found is, yes, you gain fat. Yes, your testosterone is suppressed if you're a male. On your as you come out of your competition, that and at least in our study, that recovered within 8 weeks or nearly recovered. Thyroid hormones also recovered within weeks. So we had a really good recovery of hormones, metabolic rate, even strength came back 8 weeks later. But I wish we were able to actually answer the question that you asked, which we weren't able to do.
Okay, gotcha. Maybe future research.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I do want to ask one more quick question about like refeeds and diet breaks in terms of like the psychological component of it. So I know you touched on this a little bit, but for me, just working with clients and for myself, there's just like such a psychological component of taking a break, and it being, like you said, a planned break. And especially when, if you're working with someone and they're like, okay, I'm committing to, 3 months of coaching or whatever it may be. And you tell them, and this is something that I struggle with, when I work with clients, it's like, they don't want to increase their calories. They don't want to take this refeed or this diet break because they feel like they're backtracking, right? Versus kind of just taking a pause. And they're not maybe looking further down the line, 6 months, a year from now, where they're going to be and where they want to be, versus more of that instant gratification. So have you noticed anything, or like in terms of the psychological aspects of taking those refeeds or diet breaks, and like how that's affected people maybe within your studies from that standpoint?
Yeah, so I don't do much psychological investigation, so I'm more of a physiologist. But this diet break study that we just did in resistance trained females, we did look at the 3-factor eating questionnaire. We looked at hunger drive throughout the 6-week intervention. And I think we did one more, like just how satiated were they? We have not presented that data yet, so I can't talk about the data. And you might say, well, why not? I'm like, well, I don't even know. I just know that journals don't let researchers talk about data before it's been presented at a conference. Otherwise, you put in jeopardy your ability to publish it. There are people who don't follow that, and they talk about their data before it's been presented, but I still live under the old school rules. What I can tell you is I will be able to show you data based on our diet break study, how much weight was actually gained during these. Well, let me tell you what we did. We had one group of females diet for 6 weeks straight. We had the other group of females, they also dieted for 6 weeks, but every third week they took a 1-week diet break. So dieted for 2 weeks, took a break for a whole week, dieted for 2 weeks, took a second diet break, then dieted for an additional 2 weeks. I will be able to show for the first time in resistance trained females, do they gain any weight during their diet breaks? Was it a pound? Did they lose weight? Some research shows that you don't gain any weight after on these diet breaks. So as soon as we can publish this, and hopefully that will be before the end of the year, you can literally point to our study and say, this is, on average, what we can expect to happen if you're a female and you're resistance training. I can tell you now, just in my own experience, when I used to have clients, some people gain weight during their diet breaks. Some people lose weight during their diet breaks, which doesn't make sense. And most of the females that I have personally worked with, they really don't. It's it's neutral. It's not much of a gain, or within a pound of gaining or losing. So that's been my experience. I'll soon be able to point to our data and actually publish data.
Okay. Yeah. And I think to your point too, like if you do, gain weight during that diet break, you also have to think practically about, and we talk about the daily fluctuations in this scale, right? We also have to think practically, okay, you are increasing your calories, so that's increasing the amount of food that you're consuming. So you have more food in your body. If you're increasing carbohydrates, that's increasing the amount of water that you have in your body. So yes, the scale may go up, but is that just from water, right? And so I think these are all the things that people might not necessarily think about. And so that's something that I have to really work with clients on, and education, and this entire podcast that we're recording. I'm so excited about it because I know that everybody's gonna listen to it and kind of hear these concepts and these principles. So I'm super excited about that. But I do have one last question because I know we're running low on time. In terms of like structuring a diet break or a refeed, so the way that I kind of go about it is I track all biofeedback metrics. We track weight, we track body tape measurements, all of that with the individual client. And I don't necessarily say, okay, this is the plan. Like I'll give them a plan for this is what the next 3 months looks like. But I won't necessarily say, okay, that's 3 months and then you're going to take a diet break here, or you're going to take a refeed here. Specifically diet break, I more so go off of like their biofeedback. And when I start to see these different metrics like sleep taking a hit, or like the psychological aspect, they're super, super hungry, or they're nothing satisfies them, or maybe they've hit, quote unquote, a plateau or whatever it may be. That's kind of where I implemented that. Have you seen, or within kind of your research, is there any like specific timeline that you would say for a diet break or something like that? Or is it more just kind of individual to individual?
Yeah, I think in practice, what you do is exactly what I would do. Given that we're very early in the research of this stuff, and again, I think my studies are the first ones in resistance trained populations, I don't have the luxury of doing that. We have to say every week or every 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, how do you know if it was the timing versus the actual increase in calories? So I have to, I can only control for
Mm-hmm.
one thing, and I have to control for the timing. But in practice, I like what you're doing. And when I start having conversations with individual clients, it's usually when you stop losing fat, or you stop losing weight for 2 weeks in a row or 3 weeks in a row, whatever it is. And I think this is where I think it would be important to have an agreement on the front end with your client, because that way it is planned, it is prescribed. Hey, when we get to this point, we're going to take a week off. And I think it's an easy sell then. If they haven't been losing weight, and it may be because metabolic rate has slowed down, well, this is going to be our planned fix for this. So I think it's a lot harder to argue against that, because there has been a lack of success with fat loss. But you're in the trenches. Maybe I'm making that sound too easy.
No, I agree. I was just curious if there was like a specific time point, because I know some people say like, we'll take a diet break after, 12 weeks or whatever it may be. But I found that just really comes back to the individual and kind of where you're at. And that's why like this process is just so individualized, I feel like.
Right.
But yeah. So oh man, I lost my train of thought. I think I had one more question for you, but I think we're about time, because I don't want to keep you too long. I feel like I could ask you so many so many more questions. Might have to have you come on for a part two. But do you want to kind of just tell? Actually, I do have one last question. Sorry, I always forget this. I always ask this question at the end. So is there anything that you've changed your mind about in the last year, and why? It's kind of just a put you on the spot question.
Um, I'll say, I don't know if I've changed my mind, but it's something that I've been thinking about. And maybe I have changed my mind. So it has to do around this concept of flexible dieting. And I'd say it's a concern on social media. So I think a lot of higher profile people who are lean, let's say our bodybuilders, or they have these great physiques, when they decide to splurge, they go to a baseball game and they get 2-foot-long hot dogs, or they just go off of plan. They take a picture, and this is just what I think. I could be wrong. It was in my head this morning. They take a picture of this food and they say, hey, you can deviate from your diet and still maintain a great physique. And I think that's true. But I think the message, and let me just say, I think that's true. I'm a flexible dieting advocate. I like that approach. But I think these people, that's 1% of their deviation that they're choosing to highlight. So I think the message is, oh yeah, they go out to eat all the time. Look at that. They're eating a funnel cake at the fair because that's what they chose. I think the reality is the people that are maintaining these great physiques, especially if they're 30, 40 plus, they're eating pretty much the same foods all the time, and they're very rarely going out to eat. They're very rarely having these splurges, but that's not what they're putting on their feeds. They're not highlighting that. So I think some people would say, oh yeah, look, I can do this. I don't know if you can. Again, I don't know how, I'm not saying I have a solution for this.
Yeah.
Just my thought.
No, I get what you're saying, and I agree. I think social media can be really great and really not great for things like that. And I did remember the thought that I was thinking about. It was because it was about maintenance. Just kind of coming back to this idea that it does, there is kind of a benefit from being in a period of time throughout the diet, right? That you're practicing maintenance. Because we talked about after the diet's over, like what happens? You obviously don't want to be gaining back all the weight, right? So if you've gone through a period of time, especially if you were on maybe like a six month or 8 month, whatever dieting period, and you took several diet breaks throughout that or refeeds and you were practicing maintaining your weight, I think that's super, super important in terms of not just psychologically, well, not just like physically, but also psychologically, because you know that you can actually do that, right? And I think that's super important for, the future, right? Because you don't want to be gaining back the weight. And we know that, I think there's like a stat out there, like 90% of people who lose weight gain it back. And so I think doing diet breaks and refeeds just kind of reiterates that it's important to be able to practice that maintenance and practice maintaining your new body weight or body fat percentage, whatever it is, because that will, allow you to maintain that in the future. So anyway, that was just a thought that came to mind that I remembered.
And I'll just add to that real quick. So I'm a physique scientist. I live this. This is my passion. As I look to optimize my own physique, I don't think I'm ever going to go more than 8 weeks for the rest of my life. If that sounds very dramatic, but I'm going to diet the rest of my life. I am not able to just maintain with my lifestyle and optimize my physique. I'm going to have to, at least in my head, I'll probably take a week and I will reduce my calories every month for the next year or every other month. It's just part of my lifestyle. But man, it works great for me. I can maintain an optimal physique for me with that mindset. And I'm not dieting very much. It's just here and here and here.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. Do you want to tell our listeners, because I know I follow you on social media. I love the questions that you put out, like the true or false questions on Instagram. I think they're so beneficial, and I always learn something new when I see your posts. Do you want to tell our listeners where they can find you on social media, what your website is, all of that?
Yes, I can make it very simple because I only have an Instagram page, and it is at Bill Campbell PhD. And as you said, I just give true, false, multiple choice questions, all within the area of what we discussed: dieting, some sports nutrition, weight loss, resistance training. It's all around that focus.
Love it, love it. Awesome. Well, I will link that in the show notes for our listeners to find, and I might have to have you on for another part too, because I have lots more questions that I want to ask you. But I really appreciate you being here. I know we got to run, but do you have anything else you want to share? Anything cool coming up on the horizon? I know you said you had your study coming out in the fall. Well, with everything going on, hopefully that does happen, but is there anything else you want to?
Yeah, we're finishing a rapid fat loss study in my lab that got put on hold. And when I say rapid fat loss, I'm actually anti-rapid fat loss, but we're doing this in a 2-week period with the concept of, if you do go on a diet, how aggressive can we be for 2 weeks, knowing that you're going to come out of it and take a break. So that's the kind of the context for what I'm calling rapid fat loss. So we are half done, and we're planning to start back up August 24th. And yeah, I think it makes sense. We should do this again once I have some of these other studies done, because that was new, very new content.
That'd be awesome. Super interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.